The belongings log was the first thing Darius Carter did. That was how he had done it for 28 years. Every patient, every call, every transport. The belongings log came before anything else was moved, documented, or touched. He had developed this habit not because EMS protocols required it, though they did, but because he had learned in his 3rd year on the job that the moment a patient was moved from their home or from the scene, the patient's relationship with their possessions became entirely dependent on the people responsible for their care. They could not watch. They could not document. They were in the back of an ambulance with a paramedic who was monitoring their vitals and managing their pain, and everything they owned was in a bag or on a shelf or in a jewelry box that was now beyond their sight. The belongings log was the record that said someone was paying attention. Someone was treating your things the way you would treat them if you could. He was 57 years old. He had been a paramedic with Riverside County Emergency Medical Services for 28 years, which was long enough to have seen most of what emergency medicine could produce, and long enough to have developed the specific economy of movement of someone who has done a demanding physical job for decades without injury, which is not luck, but technique. He had started at 29, which was older than most of the people who began the program with him because he had taken a different route, 6 years in the Army as a combat medic, which had given him skills and also given him the specific understanding that what you did in the time between injury and treatment was not a prelude to the real work. It was the real work. The golden hour, they called it. He called it the only hour that matters. He had grown up in Riverside, the second of 4 children, the son of a postal worker and a school aide who had raised all 4 of them with the specific combination of high standards and unconditional love that produces people who know what they are worth and who act accordingly. His mother had said to him once when he was 14 and had come home angry about something that had happened at school. A specific injustice committed by a specific teacher. You are going to experience unjust things your whole life. The question is what you do after them. The answer is you go back the next day and you do the work better than anyone can question it. He had been 14 and had not fully believed her. He had been 57 and had believed her completely for 30 years. He had joined the Army at 22 after 2 years of community college that had clarified for him that he wanted to do something with his hands and with his body, and with the specific kind of crisis that required someone to remain calm when everyone around them was not. The Army had assigned him to combat medic training, and he had discovered there that he was without question built for this. He was built for it the way some people are built for languages or mathematics, not as a performance, but as a native aptitude that practice deepens but cannot create from nothing. He had deployed twice to different assignments, and in both deployments had done the work in the way it needed to be done, which was without the luxury of reflection in the moment and with the specific clarity that comes from having no choice but to be excellent because someone's life is in your hands. He had left the Army at 28 with an honorable discharge and a clear assessment of what he wanted to do with the skills he had. The civilian EMS certification process took him 13 months because the Army's combat medic training was extensive, but not perfectly aligned with the civilian certification requirements, and he had done the 13 months without complaint because the extra learning was real and because anything real was worth doing correctly. He had joined Riverside County EMS at 29 and had been from his first week the kind of paramedic that experienced partners immediately identified as someone who had already been somewhere. He stood 6'1" with the build of someone who has moved gurneys and patients and equipment for nearly 3 decades, and who has stayed fit enough to do it correctly because incorrect movement in EMS did not just injure you, it injured the patient. He had the specific deliberateness of someone who has learned that speed and precision are the same thing when they are done correctly, and that sacrificing one for the other produces neither. He had trained 41 junior paramedics in 28 years. He had a rule log the belongings before you log anything else. He had never once in 28 years had a complaint about a missing item from a patient he had transported. The rule had originated in his 5th year on the job after a call that had nothing to do with theft and everything to do with what it felt like to be a 73-year-old man transported to a hospital in a moment of crisis with no information about where his wedding ring had gone. The man's name was Harold. His wife had died 2 years before, and the ring had been the thing he wore that still connected him to her, and when he arrived at the hospital without it, it had fallen off during transport, been found in the unit. Returned to him 3 days later, he had not been angry. He had been frightened in a way that had nothing to do with the ring, and everything to do with what happened to the things that mattered when you lost control of your situation. Darius had found the ring and returned it and had stood in Harold's hospital room and watched the way his face changed when he had the ring back in his hand. And he had gone back to his unit and written the belongings log protocol for himself more specific than the department's required version because Harold's face had told him what the requirement was for. On a Tuesday in April at 4:17 in the afternoon, Darius Carter and his partner received a call to the residence of Margaret Ellen Foley, 71, who had fallen in her bathroom and was unable to get up, and who had lain on the floor for 40 minutes before her daughter, calling from 3 states away, had heard enough in the phone call to dial 911. The call came in as a fall with possible hip fracture, which was the most common serious call in the residential zones and which Darius had run by his count more than 300 times in 28 years. He was not casual about it. 300 calls of the same type over 28 years had not made him casual. They had made him expert, which is a different thing. It means you see more clearly rather than less, because you know what to look for and you know what it means when you find it. He was already, as the unit pulled onto Mrs. Foley's street, mentally running the hip fracture protocol and the belongings log, and the specific considerations of an elderly patient alone in a house who had been on the floor for 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a long time to be on a bathroom floor. It is long enough to become afraid in the first immediate way, and then to pass through that fear and arrive somewhere quieter and worse, the specific fear of someone who has been alone with a situation for long enough to have calculated in detail what might happen if no one comes. Darius knew this. He had been on enough bathroom floors with enough people to know what 40 minutes looked like on a person's face. Margaret Foley was a retired schoolteacher. She had lived in the same house for 37 years, the house where she had raised 2 children and where she had taught herself to garden, and where the kitchen had the specific lived-in quality of a room that has prepared thousands of meals for people who mattered. She was small, thin, and frightened in the specific way that people are frightened when they have been on a floor for 40 minutes and are suddenly surrounded by strangers in uniforms. The bathroom was narrow. The light was the specific yellow-white of a bathroom at 4:15 in April. Darius came through the door and said before he checked her pulse or assessed her injury in a voice calibrated specifically for the acoustics and the emotional terrain of a bathroom floor, "Mrs. Foley. My name is Darius. I have been doing this for 28 years. You are going to be fine. We are going to take care of you." He had used his first name because first names reduced the clinical distance, and the clinical distance was not what Mrs. Foley needed. He had said 28 years because 28 years was real and specific and grounded the situation in something concrete. He had said you are going to be fine because she needed to hear it, and because it was in his assessment true. She had said I didn't want to bother anyone. He had said you called the right people. She had said, "Is it bad?" He had said, "I'm going to tell you exactly what I find." He had assessed. He had told her exactly what he found. She had said, "My daughter is going to worry." He had said, "Your daughter has already been contacted by the dispatch system. She knows someone is here. She is going to call the hospital when you arrive, and you will be able to talk to her tonight." Mrs. Foley had looked at him with the specific look of a 71-year-old woman who has been alone with a situation and who is now for the first time in 40 minutes talking to someone who is managing it, and the look had contained something that was not quite gratitude, yet it was closer to relief that gratitude would be possible. Her hip was fractured. It was a clean fracture. The imaging confirmed it later, and she would require surgery and a 6-week rehabilitation, but she would return to her house and her life with the specific limitations of a 71-year-old who had fallen and who had been found by good people. She did return. She sent a card to the department 8 weeks after the incident addressed to Darius Carter, in which she said, "You told me I was going to be fine, and I believed you immediately. That is a skill. I was a school teacher for 32 years, and I know the difference between a voice that has something to say and a voice that knows how to say it. You have both." The card was placed in his personnel file beside the Ann Foley commendation that was added later. He read both once. He did not need to read them again. They were in the record. The record was where they belonged. Darius assessed the fracture without moving her. He provided pain management. He stabilized the hip in the standard protocol position. He talked to her the entire time, not with the generic reassurances that begin to sound like noise when they're repeated too often, but with specific observations and specific questions, the photographs on the bathroom shelf that looked like grandchildren. The specific nature of the pain when he applied gentle pressure to the iliac crest, the name of her daughter who was 3 states away and whom she was worried about worrying. He did the belongings log in the 5 minutes before the gurney was ready. The gurney required the specific coordination of 2 people in a narrow hallway and a narrow bathroom door, and while Aldrich positioned the equipment, Darius completed the log in the order he always completed it. Observation first, then photograph, then secure, then document. He did this in the bathroom while Mrs. Foley was still on the floor because the belongings log was done before the patient was moved. Not after, because once the patient was on the gurney and in motion, the environment of the belongings changed and the moment of first documentation had to be the moment of first observation. He had explained this to Devon on Monday, and he had explained it in various versions to 41 paramedics over 28 years. The explanation was always the same: you document what is there before it is anywhere else. Because once it is somewhere else, you are describing something you remember rather than something you see. Margaret Foley had been wearing a gold ring on her right hand, a ring with a small oval amethyst in a yellow gold setting worn and scratched in the way of jewelry that has been worn for many decades and that has become part of the hand rather than an ornament on it. He noted it in the log with the specific description gold ring oval amethyst. Right hand, 4th finger, and he noted her earrings, small gold posts, and her wristwatch, a Timex on a leather band. He photographed all 3 items on his phone's documentation function, which created a time-stamped image in the call file. He placed the ring and the earrings in the secure belongings envelope, sealed it with the adhesive strip, wrote Mrs. M. Foley on the outside with the call number and the date and time, and placed it in the designated secure compartment in the ambulance's patient care area. The watch stayed on her wrist because the watch strap was a standard clasp and because Mrs. Foley had looked at her watch 3 times during the assessment, and he had not seen a reason to add the disorientation of removing it. His partner that day was Wade Aldrich. Aldrich was 31. He had been with Riverside County EMS for 3 years, which was long enough to know the protocols and not long enough to have developed the habits that protocols eventually become when they are applied correctly for long enough. He was competent in the technical requirements of the job. His assessments were accurate. His communication with hospital staff was clear. He was fast with the equipment and rarely made mechanical errors. He was not someone Darius had complained about. He was not someone Darius had a specific problem with. He was someone Darius had worked alongside for 2 months on overlapping shifts and had assessed as technically capable and personally unremarkable, which was in the range of partners Darius had worked with over 28 years, an acceptable middle category. Darius had noticed some things. He was a noticer. It was part of the job, and it had become part of his character, to the point where the line between professional observation and personal nature was not always clear. He had noticed that Aldrich made certain assumptions about certain neighborhoods before they arrived. He had noticed that the assumptions tended to be negative, and that they tended to concern neighborhoods with higher proportions of black and brown residents. He had not said anything about these observations, because the observations were impressions, and impressions were not complaints, and he had been in the department long enough to know the difference. He had filed the observations in the back of his assessment of Aldrich and kept working. He had 2 prior complaints in his personnel file that had nothing to do with clinical performance. The first had been filed by a paramedic named Jerome Ellis, who had been Aldrich's partner for 4 months before requesting a reassignment. Ellis had written in his complaint, "Aldrich makes comments about the neighborhoods we respond to that I believe are based on race. I have heard him say things that I would not repeat in a formal document without the documentation being taken seriously, and I do not believe it will be." He described 3 specific incidents in which Aldrich had made comments that suggested a differential attitude toward patients of color. The complaint had been reviewed and closed as a personality conflict with a note that no specific incident had been documented with sufficient particularity to warrant disciplinary action. The review had not included any interviews with patients from the relevant calls or with other crew members who had been present. Jerome Ellis had requested a transfer out of the unit after the complaint was closed. He had not been asked why. The transfer had been processed in 2 days. The second complaint had been filed by a black EMT named Carla Washington, who had been on a call with Aldrich and 2 other crew members at a residence in the eastern part of the county. She alleged that during the call, while they were securing the patient's belongings, Aldrich had said in a voice audible to the patient and to the other 2 crew members present that he wanted to make sure everything was logged because he had concerns about items going missing on calls like this one. The phrase "calls like this one" had been said in a manner that Washington described as indicating the neighborhood or the patient rather than any specific documented risk. She had filed the complaint the following day and had attached a statement that said, "I have been in EMS for 6 years. I know the difference between a general caution about documentation and a targeted comment about who might steal from whom. This was not a general caution." Both other crew members had been interviewed. Both had said in separate interviews that they could not recall the specific words. The complaint had been reviewed and closed as insufficient evidence of misconduct. Both complaints had been reviewed individually. Neither had been read alongside the other. The pattern that both complaints described Aldrich making comments or implications that associated black colleagues or black patients or black neighborhoods with the likelihood of theft or improper handling had been in the file for 14 months. No one had read both documents at the same time. The transport to Riverside General was 11 minutes. Darius monitored Mrs. Foley's vitals, administered the second pain management dosage at the threshold he had assessed, and spoke to her throughout. He told her that her daughter had been notified by the 911 dispatch system and would be called by the hospital upon arrival. He told her the name of the attending who was likely to receive her because he knew the staff at Riverside General, and he had worked with Dr. Sandra Krishnamurthy for 9 years. And he knew that Krishnamurthy was the specific kind of physician who made frightened patients feel immediately safer, and that knowing a name was often the most useful information he could give a patient at the end of a transport. At the hospital, he handed off the case with the full verbal report: vitals, injury assessment, pain management, administered timeline of events from the 911 call. He handed the belongings envelope to the charge nurse, Patricia Holt, who signed the belongings transfer receipt, which completed the chain of custody for the items. He noted the transfer in the call record. He collected the signed receipt and filed it in the unit's documentation folder. The call was complete. He had done everything correctly in the order he had always done it, the way he had done it for 28 years. The transport took 11 minutes, and the handoff at Riverside General was conducted by the book. Darius gave the full verbal report to Dr. Krishnamurthy's team vitals. Injury assessment, pain management timeline, patient history as provided by Mrs. Foley and by the neighbor who had been called in the interim. He handed the belongings envelope to Patricia Holt, the charge nurse, and waited while she signed the transfer receipt. He noted the transfer and collected the signed receipt and placed it in the call documentation. Mrs. Foley had been taken to imaging by the time he left the building. She had looked at him from the gurney as they wheeled her in and said, "Thank you, Darius." He had said, "You're in good hands. Krishnamurthy is excellent." He had meant it. He had sent more than 40 patients to Krishnamurthy in 9 years, and she had never once given him a reason to stop meaning it. He drove back to the garage and completed the call report and restocked the unit and logged off his shift at 6:15. He drove home in the specific quiet of someone who has worked a good shift and who knows it and who does not need to say so because the knowing is enough. The allegation was filed 4 days later. Mrs. Foley's daughter, Ann Foley, who had flown in from Denver when she learned about her mother's fall, contacted the EMS department on a Friday morning and reported that her mother's amethyst ring was not among her belongings at the hospital. She was concerned. She was not accusatory. She said, "I'm sure it was logged somewhere, I just can't find it. I wanted to make sure it wasn't misplaced." The EMS department's administrative coordinator checked the belongings transfer log and found the entry ring, gold oval, amethyst, right hand, fourth finger, documented and transferred to Riverside General Charge Nurse Patricia Holt, signed receipt on file. She called Ann Foley back and said the ring was logged and transferred to the hospital upon arrival. The hospital's belongings coordinator should have it in their secure inventory. The hospital's belongings coordinator checked and could not find the ring in the secure inventory. She checked twice. The envelope was not there. The signed receipt from the EMS side was in the file, but the corresponding envelope was not in the hospital's inventory. Something had happened between the transfer and the hospital's logging of it. The ring had not been logged into the hospital system. This was not a proof of theft. It was a gap in the chain of custody on the hospital side, a gap that hospital administrators subsequently attributed to a temporary belongings coordinator who had been covering a sick day and who had received the envelope but had not entered it into the inventory system before the end of her shift, and who had placed the envelope in a drawer rather than the secure box. The ring was recovered 6 days later in the drawer by the regular coordinator when she returned from sick leave. But on the Friday that Ann Foley called and the envelope could not be found, Aldrich filed a report. The report was filed at 2:14 in the afternoon, 6 hours after Ann Foley's call to the department. It was filed through the department's standard incident reporting system, which required a supervisor's signature before submission. The supervisor who signed it that afternoon was a shift supervisor named Thomas Reedy, who had been with the department for 11 years. And who had read the report and had found nothing in it that required him to withhold his signature, because the report described an observation by a paramedic that was relevant to a missing item complaint, and that was being submitted through the appropriate channel. Reedy had not seen Aldrich's prior complaint history, because the complaint history lived in the personnel file, and the personnel file required a separate access request, and Reedy had not thought to request it, because supervisors do not routinely pull personnel files when reviewing standard incident reports. The report said during transport of the above-named patient on the date indicated I observed my partner, Paramedic Darius Carter, handle the patient's personal jewelry without conducting the standard belongings log in my presence or in the presence of the patient. I had concerns at the time about the handling of the patient's ring specifically. I did not raise these concerns during the transport because I was uncertain about what I had observed, and I did not wish to create a confrontation without being certain. Given the current report of a missing item from this patient's transport, I believe it is appropriate to document my observation for the record. The report was 4 sentences. Every sentence was a lie. The report went to the division supervisor, Roger Crane, who read it and initiated a review in the standard manner because the standard manner did not require anything other than what Crane had an incident report from a paramedic, a missing item complaint from a patient's family, and the same supervisor's signature that all incident reports required. He had not pulled Aldrich's personnel file. He had not read the prior complaints. The prior complaints lived in the file, and the file required an access request that standard review processes did not trigger. Crane had followed the procedure. The procedure had not been designed to catch what the procedure had not been designed to look for. Darius Carter was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. He was notified by phone. He had driven to the garage that morning at 5:30 and run a full equipment check on his unit and signed the shift log, and then received the call at 6:30 Friday evening, which meant that he had spent the full working day between his morning check and the Friday evening call doing the job correctly, logging every call, filing every receipt, running the protocol the way he always ran it. The day itself was a complete record of what he was and how he worked. The day itself was the answer to the report. The day itself was not yet in the system as a response because the response was going to take 2 days. Darius Carter learned of the allegation at 6:30 Friday evening when his division supervisor, Roger Crane, called him at home. Crane told him about Ann Foley's call about the hospital not finding the ring in inventory, and about the report that Aldrich had filed. He told him that he was being placed on administrative leave pending review of the allegation. Darius listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He sat in the kitchen of his house in the chair he sat in when he took calls at home, and he listened to the division supervisor tell him that a report had been filed questioning the integrity of a 28-year career based on a ring that was documented, photographed, sealed in a signed envelope, and transferred to a charge nurse at Riverside General Hospital 4 days ago. When Crane finished, Darius said, "I logged that ring at 4:32 on Tuesday. I photographed it. I transferred it to Patricia Holt at Riverside General. I have the signed receipt in the documentation folder at the garage." He said, "I have done this correctly for 28 years. He said these things in the flat and specific voice of someone who is making sure the record is clear, not because he expected the clarity to change the situation immediately, but because clarity was his first obligation in any situation. He said, "I would like to see the footage from Unit 14. Crane said, "What footage?" Darius said Unit 14 was retrofitted with interior patient compartment cameras 18 months ago. "I was on the pilot committee for that program. I attended the implementation meeting. I signed the pilot program participation agreement. Every call I have run in Unit 14 for the past 18 months has been recorded." He paused. He said the Tuesday call was in Unit 14. "I know because I checked the assignment that morning and noted the unit number. I note it every morning." There was a silence on the phone. Crane said, "I'll pull the footage tomorrow." Darius said, "I would like it pulled tonight." He said it without aggression. He said it because every additional hour the allegations sat without the footage being reviewed was an hour in which he was on administrative leave based on a report that the footage would address completely, and he was not willing to wait for the administration's convenience when his career was the thing that was waiting. Crane said he would see what he could do. Darius said, "Thank you, Roger." He said it as a statement, not a plea. He put the phone down. He sat in the kitchen for 20 minutes. He was aware of what he was feeling, which was a specific kind of anger that is different from hot anger. Not the anger of a moment, but the anger of a person who has spent 28 years doing the job correctly, and who is sitting in his kitchen on a Friday evening because someone has filed a report and the report has done in 4 hours what 28 years of doing the job correctly has not been able to insulate against. He let himself feel it. He did not do anything with it except feel it, because doing something with anger before you know what you are doing is how you make the situation worse. And his mother had told him that at 14, and he had believed it for 30 years. He called his daughter, who was 31, and who worked as an attorney in the city, and who answered the phone immediately because she had learned over 31 years of being his daughter that when her father called on a Friday evening, it was worth answering. He told her what had happened. She listened. She said, "The camera footage covers it." He said, "Yes." She said, "How long has 14 had cameras?" He said, 18 months. She said, "Then this is going to be over quickly." He said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It doesn't feel like that right now, though." She said, "I know. Come for breakfast tomorrow." He said, "I will." He went to bed. He slept adequately, which was better than he expected, and which he attributed to 28 years of EMS training that had produced in him the specific capacity to sleep when sleep was available, because there was no guarantee it would be available when the next call came. The footage from Unit 14's interior patient compartment camera for the 417 call on Tuesday showed in full and unambiguous detail the following. Darius Carter performing the belongings log at 4:26, photographing the ring, the earrings, and the watch with his documentation phone, placing the ring and earrings in the secure envelope, writing the identifying information on the outside of the envelope in his specific block, printing, sealing the envelope with the adhesive strip, and placing it in the secure compartment in the forward left quadrant of the patient care area. The timestamp on the camera confirmed the timestamp on the photograph documentation. Every action was visible. Every action was in the correct order. The footage showed every movement in the patient compartment from the moment the unit door closed at the scene through the moment the unit door opened at Riverside General Hospital, which was 29 minutes of uninterrupted footage of Darius Carter doing the job the way Darius Carter did the job. It also showed Wade Aldrich. At 4:41, during the final 2 minutes of transport, while Darius was at Mrs. Foley's side conducting the concluding vital sign assessment and making notes in the call record and talking to Mrs. Foley about the hospital in the specific voice he used to reduce the anxiety of a patient approaching the moment of handoff. The footage showed Aldrich at the forward section of the patient care area. He was not assigned to any function in the forward section during the concluding portion of the transport. He reached into the secure compartment and removed the belongings envelope. He looked at it. He opened it. He removed the ring. He placed the ring in the pocket of his uniform pants, which required a specific action because the pocket had a flap closure, which he unsnapped and re-snapped. He replaced the empty envelope in the compartment. He returned to his position. The entire sequence took 43 seconds. The footage was clear. The angle was clear. The lighting in the patient compartment was adequate for the camera's specifications. The timestamp was clear. The sequence was complete and unambiguous in what it showed and in what it meant. The footage was reviewed on Saturday morning at 7:30 by Roger Crane and the department's internal affairs officer, whose name was Louise Park, and the department's legal counsel, whose name was David Hines. They had pulled the footage Friday night after Crane's call to Darius, because Crane had understood from that call that if the footage existed, he needed to see it before the review process went any further. He had called Park at 8:15 Friday evening and said, "I need you to pull the footage from Unit 14's compartment camera for Tuesday's 417 call, and I need you to look at it before morning." Park had said, "I'll call Hines." They had watched it Friday night separately and had come in Saturday morning to watch it together. They watched it twice on Saturday morning. Nobody said anything for a specific interval of time. After the second viewing, the footage was still playing on the screen past the 41-minute mark, and no one had moved to stop it. Then Park said, "I need to make a call to the detective division." Crane said yes. Hines said, "Before you do, I want to note for the record that the documentation from the photograph log, the belongings, envelope entry, the signed transfer receipt, all predates the allegation by 4 days and is consistent with the footage in every detail." Crane said, "Noted." He said, "I need to call Darius Carter." Park said, "Make your call first." Crane said, "I will." He called Darius Carter at 10:15 on Saturday morning. He said, "Mr. Carter, the footage has been reviewed. You are fully cleared. I owe you an apology for the manner in which this was handled." He said it without qualification, which was the correct approach and which Darius recognized as such. Darius said yes. "You do." He said it without anger, which was harder than anger because anger would have been easy, and he had spent the night moving past easy. He said it because it was accurate, and because making an accurate statement to the person who owed you an apology was what his mother had called the correct response. He said, "What did the footage show?" Crane said it showed you doing your job completely and correctly. He paused. He said it showed other things as well. Darius said I expected it would. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When can I come back?" Crane said Monday morning. Darius said I will be there at 5:30. Aldrich was terminated the following Tuesday. A criminal complaint for theft was filed. The belongings envelope had been recovered on scene. The empty envelope with Darius's writing on the outside placed back in the compartment, and it was submitted as physical evidence together with the camera footage. Aldrich's attorney made no substantive challenge to the footage because the footage was what the footage was. The department's internal affairs office, in the course of processing Aldrich's termination, read his full personnel file. They read the complaint from Jerome Ellis. They read the complaint from Carla Washington. They read the Friday report. They read them in the same review session because the termination process required a complete file review and the review officer was thorough. The pattern in the 3 documents was not subtle once they were read together. In each instance, Aldrich had raised a concern about the professional conduct of a black colleague, specifically a concern related to the handling of patients or patient property. In 2 of the 3 instances, the black colleague had been the person in the vehicle or at the scene with the most seniority experience and procedural correctness. The review officer wrote in her finding the 3 complaints read in sequence establish a consistent pattern of conduct in which the subject raised allegations against black colleagues that were not supported by the available evidence, and that, in the current instance, were directly contradicted by camera footage. The previous 2 complaints were reviewed in isolation and closed without pattern recognition. This finding notes that the pattern recognition capability was available in the department's existing file system for the duration of both prior complaints. The sequential review procedure is being recommended as a standard requirement. Jerome Ellis was contacted by the Internal Affairs Review Officer on the Wednesday after Aldrich's termination. He was working a hospital nursing shift when the call came, and he stepped out of the ward to take it. The review officer told him that his complaint had been reviewed as part of the pattern finding in the Aldrich personnel file and that the finding had confirmed what he had described in his original complaint and had noted it in the formal record. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't think anyone believed me." The review officer said the record shows that you were correct in what you described and that the previous review did not have the benefit of the sequential analysis that would have shown the pattern at the time of your complaint. He said the benefit of sequential analysis. He repeated it the way people repeat a formal phrase when they need to translate it into what it means. He said, "You mean, if someone had read my complaint next to someone else's complaint, they would have seen it." She said, "Yes. That's what that means." He said, "I transferred out of EMS after 6 months of trying to get the complaint taken seriously. I went into nursing." She said, "I'm sorry it cost you that." He said, "I don't know if it was all a loss. I like nursing, but I liked EMS too." He was quiet again. He said, "I wrote 2 pages in that complaint. I was specific. I told them exactly what I heard and when and where." She said, "I read it." "You were." He said, "It's enough now, I guess." She said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Good. Then I'm glad I kept the copy." He had kept the copy of his complaint in a folder in his apartment for 2.5 years. Not because he expected it to be used, because it was the truth of something that had happened and he had written it down and he did not discard things that were true. Carla Washington was contacted on the same day. She was still with Riverside County EMS, having stayed on despite the closed complaint, because leaving would have meant Aldrich's behavior costing her a career she had worked for, and she had decided she was not going to let it cost her that. When the review officer called her and told her the findings, she said, "I wrote down what I heard." 2 people were standing there who also heard it, and they both said they couldn't remember the specific words. I understand why. I know what it costs to remember specific words sometimes. She was told that the combined record was more than enough, and that her complaint was now part of the institutional finding and part of the formal basis for the personnel action. She said, "Good." Then she said, "Darius Carter has been at this department since before I started. If you're talking to him, tell him from me that I'm glad the camera was running." "The review officer said I'll tell him," she said. "And tell him I'm glad he kept the receipt." Darius Carter returned to work on the Monday after the footage review cleared him. He drove to the garage at 5:30, which was a half hour earlier than his shift required and an hour and a half earlier than most of his colleagues arrived. He had spent the weekend at his daughter's house for breakfast on Saturday, and at home on Sunday in the specific quiet of a man who has 2 days to do nothing, and who has spent 28 years in a profession that does not give days to do nothing without a reason. He had cooked. He had called his mother in Riverside, who was 81 and who still answered the phone before the second ring. He had told her what had happened. She had listened. She had said, "What did I tell you?" He had said, "Go back the next day and do the work better than anyone can question it." She had said, "Go back on Monday." He had said, "I'm going back Monday." She had said, "Good. Call me Tuesday." He had said, "I will." He checked Unit 14 first. The camera was operational, the indicator light steady, the lens clear, the recording function confirmed by a 30-second test. He checked the equipment in the patient compartment. He checked the secure compartment. He checked the belongings envelope supply. He signed into the shift log at 5:47 and noted the unit number and the camera status in the shift log, which was not required by protocol, but which he did because he had helped write the pilot program documentation, and because the camera status was worth noting. The department director came to the garage at 6:15. She was a woman named Sandra Okafor who had run the department for 11 years and who had been in EMS for 23 years before that. She found Darius at the equipment table and said, "I want to say something to you directly." Darius said, "I'm listening." She said the manner in which this was handled was not adequate to your record or to your conduct. The allegation should not have gone as far as it did before the footage was pulled. I take responsibility for the procedure that allowed it to go that far. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "What are you changing?" She said the footage pull is now the first step in any allegation involving a call on a camera-equipped unit, not a step that requires a department request after the allegation is already in the system. He said, "Good." She said it will also be retroactive for open allegations. He said there are open allegations on camera-equipped units. She said, "There were 2. Both have been reviewed and resolved." He said, "Good." She said, "I'm glad you're back." He said, "I'm glad to be back." He meant it. He was glad to be anywhere that had a unit to check and a shift log to sign and work to do that was worth doing. His new partner for the shift was a 24-year-old named Devin Green, who was 9 months into his career and who had asked to be assigned to Darius Carter specifically by name in a request he had submitted to the scheduling office 3 weeks before the incident. Devin had heard Darius speak at the department's new hire orientation 6 months earlier, a 15-minute talk about documentation practice and chain of custody that other new hires had described as the most useful 15 minutes of the orientation, and had decided then that he wanted to work with the person who spoke about belongings logs. The way other people spoke about things they had thought about for decades, which was exactly what it was. Devin came in at 6 and found Darius doing the equipment check and said, "Glad you're back." Darius said, "Glad to be here." Devin said, "I heard what happened." Darius looked at him and said, "Then you know why the log matters." Devin said, "I do." Darius said, "Sit down. Let me show you something." He showed Devin the log, the specific version he used, which was more detailed than the department's required form, and which he had been using since the Herald call in his 5th year. He showed him the photograph documentation function on the department-issued phone, including the timestamp that embedded in the file and the call number that linked the photograph to the specific incident record. He showed him the secure compartment and the envelope and the adhesive seal and the identifying information protocol. He showed him the signed transfer receipt and how it was collected and filed and where it lived in the documentation folder and why it lived there. He said this is not just a protocol. The protocol tells you what to do. The practice tells you how to do it so that it actually protects the patient and protects yourself in that order. The patient's ring in that log and that envelope is protected because they cannot watch it themselves. The log is your record that you were watching it for them. He paused. He said the camera in that compartment is 18 months old. The log is 28 years old. Both of them matter. But the log was there before the camera and would have been there without it. Do the log because the log is right. The camera will confirm what is already true. Devin said, "Yes, sir." Darius said, "Don't call me sir. Call me Darius. Call me when you have a question." He stood up and started the final equipment check. Devin stood up and started on the other side of the unit. They worked in the specific complementary quiet of two people who have not yet learned each other's rhythms, but who are both oriented toward the same thing, which is enough to start with. Aldrich's criminal case was referred to the county district attorney's office on the Thursday of the same week. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment and subsequently attempted to challenge the camera footage on technical grounds. The argument being that the camera's angle was not sufficient to confirm the identity of the person visible in the footage. The technical challenge was reviewed by a forensic video analyst retained by the district attorney's office, who found that the camera's angle was sufficient for identification, that Aldrich's uniform name badge was visible in 3 frames, and that his face was clearly visible in 2. The challenge was withdrawn. Aldrich ultimately entered a plea that resulted in a conviction for theft and a sentence that included restitution and a permanent bar from working in any position involving access to patient care settings. His law enforcement and EMS certifications were revoked. Margaret Foley's ring was recovered from the hospital's misplaced items drawer by the regular belongings coordinator on the 6th day after the incident. The coordinator called Ann Foley and told her what had happened and where the ring had been. Ann Foley said, "Can you describe it?" The coordinator described it. Ann Foley was quiet and then said, "That's it." "Yes, that is exactly it." She said, "I'm glad it wasn't lost." She did not know at that point what had actually happened. She was told when her inquiry into the EMS process was followed up by the department's administrative office, who called her and explained the full sequence of events and the finding. She was quiet for a longer time. She said, "I want to say something about the paramedic." The coordinator said, "Mr. Carter." She said, "Yes. I want to say that when he came into my mother's bathroom and told her he had been doing this for 28 years and that she was going to be fine. My mother said later that she felt fine. Not because of the medication, before the medication. She said his voice was the first thing in 40 minutes that made the situation feel manageable. She said I would like that to be on his record. The coordinator said I will make sure it is." The interior camera program was extended to all 14 units in the department's fleet within 60 days of the incident. The extension had been in discussion for 4 months before the incident stalled by budget questions and scheduling concerns. After the Tuesday footage review, the discussion lasted 40 minutes. The department director said, "We already know what the cameras do. We have the footage from Unit 14. Extend the program." The 60-day timeline was the logistical minimum. The new sequential review protocol for personnel complaints was adopted within 30 days. The protocol required that any employee who received a second complaint within an 18-month period have both complaints reviewed together before either was closed. It required a single document containing the summary of both complaints and the finding. It required that the reviewer confirm in writing that the 2 complaints had been read as a sequence, and that the sequence had been assessed for pattern rather than treated as 2 independent events. The protocol was 2 pages. It did not require the Aldrich incident to explain why it was necessary. It required only that someone in the department had decided that reading one complaint at a time was not sufficient. Jerome Ellis was asked whether he would be willing to speak at the department's annual training session about his experience filing the complaint. He agreed. He spoke for 12 minutes. He said, "I wrote 2 pages. I was specific. I described what I heard and when and where and who else was present. I filed it through the correct channel. It was reviewed and closed. I transferred out of EMS 6 months later." He said, "I am glad to be here telling you this because it means the department read the file." He paused. He said, "The lesson is not about what I did. The lesson is about what happens when someone reads the whole file instead of 1 page at a time." He looked at the room. He said, "Read the whole file, every time." "That is all I have." The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Sandra Okafor, the department director, said, "Thank you, Mr. Ellis." He said, "Thank you for inviting me." He sat down. Darius Carter was in the back of the room. He had attended every annual training session for 28 years. He had spoken at 7 of them. This year he listened. He thought about Harold's ring and Devin writing it down and Carla Washington staying in the department and Jerome Ellis keeping the copy of the complaint. He thought about the 41 paramedics in the list and what the list was for. He was 57 years old, and he had been doing this for 28 years, and the job was still teaching him things. He was still learning to receive what it taught. Darius ran his first call with Devin on the Monday of his return, a 63-year-old man with a suspected cardiac event in a neighborhood 4 miles from the garage. The call went well. The man was stabilized and transported and handed off, and the call was completed correctly by 2 people who had never worked together in a way that suggested they would work together well. Devin did the belongings log on the first call without being told. The patient had a wallet in his jacket pocket and a watch on his wrist, both observed during the initial assessment, and Devin logged both before the gurney moved. He logged the watch. He logged the wallet. He photographed both items with the documentation phone. He sealed the envelope and wrote the identifying information in careful printing and placed it in the compartment. The envelope was sealed. The compartment was closed. The log was in the call record. He had done it without a prompt and without oversight, because he had been shown how to do it 6 hours earlier, and he had understood why, and he had done it. He said to Darius after the handoff at the hospital standing by the unit, "I did the log." Darius said, "I know. I watched." He said, "You missed the wedding ring." Devin looked at him. He said it was still on his hand when they transferred. "I didn't want to remove it if it wasn't necessary." Darius said, "That's correct judgment. Not every item requires a removal. You assess whether removal is necessary, and you document your assessment." Devin said I should document the assessment. Darius said you document everything. If the ring is on the hand, and you've assessed that it's secure, you write ring gold, left hand assessed stable, left in place. Then if someone asks you later why the ring is still on the hand, you have the answer already written. Devin wrote it down. Darius noted that he wrote it down, which was a good sign. The people who wrote things down during training were the ones who still had it 28 years later. He had seen both kinds, the ones who nodded and retained it, and the ones who wrote it down and retained it longer. Devin was the second kind. The second kind were the ones who became the paramedics that 9 months in people asked to be assigned to. He thought about the 41 paramedics he had trained. He thought about Jerome Ellis, who had left EMS and gone into nursing and who had written 2 pages in a complaint and kept a copy for 2.5 years because he had believed the 2 pages were true. He thought about Carla Washington, who had stayed on when staying was harder and who had told the review officer she was glad the camera was running and glad he had kept the receipt. He thought about them the way he thought about all 41 as a list, the way he kept all his lists not a trophy list, but a record of the thing that mattered. What had each of them carried forward from the time they had worked together? What had the work built in them? What had they done with it? He thought that is the job. Not the calls, which were the vehicle. The job was what the calls built in the people who ran them. The job was Devin writing it down. The job was Jerome Ellis keeping the copy. The job was a ring in an envelope in a compartment with a signed receipt and a time-stamped photograph ready for whoever needed to look at it whenever they needed to look. They ran 4 calls that Monday. On the 4th call, a respiratory event in an apartment building 3rd floor, no elevator. Devin moved the gurney and the equipment up the stairs in the way that someone with 9 months of practice moves things upstairs, which was fast enough to be useful and not quite efficient enough to be correct in the specific way that Darius was. On the way back down, Darius said, "Your stair angle needs to change." Devin said, "What do you mean?" Darius said, "You're putting the weight on the wrong part of the rail. You're going to hurt your shoulder in about 18 months. Devin said, "How do I fix it?" Darius said, "Here." He showed him. Devin said, "That feels wrong." Darius said, "New technique always feels wrong. Try it on the next call and then tell me what it feels like after 20 minutes. Devin said, "Okay." He tried it on the next call. He said it feels less wrong. Darius said that's how it starts. He had said this same sentence to 41 paramedics over 28 years. All 41 of them had at some point said it feels wrong. He had said, "Try it and tell me what it feels like after 20 minutes. 11 of the 41 had come back to tell him specifically that the technique change had prevented an injury they had subsequently identified as the specific injury the technique would have produced. 22 of the 41 had told him at various points in their careers some version of the following: "The thing I learned from you that I use every day is not the big thing. It's the specific small thing you showed me when I was 9 months in. That's the thing I kept." The signed belongings transfer receipt from the 417 call was still in the documentation folder. It had been there since Tuesday. It would have been there regardless of the footage because Darius Carter had filed it, because that was what he did, because he had been doing it for 28 years. And he was not going to stop doing it because someone in a system had decided his 28 years and his signed receipt and his time-stamped photographs were worth less than an allegation with no supporting evidence. The evidence had been in the compartment. The camera had been running. The log had been filed before any of it mattered, and it would have mattered with or without the camera, because the log told the story of how a person does their job when they believe the job deserves it completely in order before anyone is watching. He had started that log the day after Harold, the 73-year-old with the lost wedding ring, had held the ring in his hand in the hospital room and looked at it. He had been doing it for 23 years since. He had never missed it. He did not do it because a camera confirmed it. The camera confirmed what was already true. The log was already true. It had been true since Tuesday at 4:26 when he had written the words in his block printing on the outside of the envelope ring, "Gold oval, amethyst, right hand, 4th finger." The ring and the log and the receipt and the photographs were true before anyone questioned them. That was the point. That had always been the point. They do the job that way because the job deserves it, not because a camera will confirm it. The camera confirms what is already true. What is already true was true before the camera. It will be true after. It has always been true. The only question is whether the people who needed to see it finally looked. In this case, they did. It took a camera and a receipt and 28 years of doing it right. The belongings log from the 417 call on Tuesday in April was in the documentation folder where Darius Carter had put it. It had been there since 5:30 on the day Darius returned from administrative leave, when he had gone to the folder before his shift started to confirm that the documentation was complete and in order. It was. He had checked the signed receipt. He had confirmed the photograph timestamp. He had confirmed the log entry. He had closed the folder and put it in the file and started the equipment check on Unit 14 where the camera was operational and the compartment was clean and everything was in the order that it had been put in when the shift before this one was done. He had done all of this before the call came in. He had done it because that was what he did. He had been doing it for 28 years. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who log the belongings before the camera rolls. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.